The tremors shaking global capitals are not triggered by missiles or markets. They rise from the soil of Africa, where a generation refuses to remain the world's supplier of raw materials and little else. A continent that owns 60% of the planet's uncultivated arable land and 30% of its minerals still imports food and exports poverty. This paradox is not fate, it is design. From this soil of contradiction, one figure has come to symbolize a turning tide. Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a young officer who expelled foreign troops and demanded that his nation's gold be refined at home, represents not only a man, but a moment. His call is larger than borders. It is a question to an entire continent. Will Africa continue as a warehouse for others, or will it rise as a sovereign power shaping its own destiny? Do not look away. What follows may change how we read the map of tomorrow. Subscribe and stay with us. Your voice matters in this unfolding story. This is not charity. This is not aid. This is sovereignty in motion, and the struggle for it is only beginning. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation often dismissed on world maps as marginal, became the stage for a drama that unsettled entire empires. When Ibrahim Traoré declared that French troops would no longer patrol his soil, the announcement traveled faster than any bullet. It was not merely an expulsion. It was a declaration of ownership over a future too long stolen. The decision to renegotiate mining contracts was the next tremor. For decades, tons of gold had left Burkinabe soil to be refined and branded abroad, leaving behind scarred earth and schnamsum and empty coffers. Traoré's government demanded that a greater share of profits stay within national borders. This act, simple in its logic yet radical in its defiance, broke the pattern of extraction that had bound the country since independence. Numbers tell the story more sharply than rhetoric. Africa possesses 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet it imports food worth $60 billion each year. It holds 30% of global mineral reserves, including the vast majority of platinum and cobalt, yet it ranks lowest in GDP per capita. This paradox is not geography, it is geopolitics. Burkina Faso became the symbol of a continent reclaiming its arithmetic. The soil is more than dirt. It is a metaphor for power. Traoré's call to process gold at home is a seed planted against centuries of exploitation. If the seed grows, it may inspire fields across Africa to stop exporting raw grain for pennies and start baking bread for billions. The echoes of Thomas Sankara's revolution resurface here. The president who once planted 10 million trees and achieved food self-sufficiency in just 4 years before his life was cut short. His dream was buried, but never rotted. It waited, dormant, until another generation was ready to water it. Events in Ouagadougou reverberated across borders. Young Africans from Mali to Niger saw in Traoré a mirror of their own frustrations. Nations rich in resources yet poor in dignity. When they witnessed French bases closing and Burkinabe streets celebrating, they realized that sovereignty could be practiced, not just preached. The symbolism of one small country shaking the structures of global power became undeniable. Internationally, commentators struggled to frame this moment. Western analysts called it reckless, destabilizing, even dangerous. But within the streets of West Africa, it was called necessary. For too long, leaders had bowed in exchange for aid packages, loans with strings, or security arrangements that served external interests. By rejecting that pattern, Burkina Faso placed itself on the front line of a continental awakening. The narrative is not one of isolation, but of choice. Traoré pursued partnerships with nations willing to share technology without dictating politics. Tractors instead of troops, transfer of skills instead of lectures on governance. This alternative vision frightened established powers precisely because it broke the monopoly on African futures. Every timeline has turning points. In the 20th century, the wave of independence brought flags and anthems, but left economies tethered. In the 21st, the wave may be different. Economic independence carried on the shoulders of a new generation that refuses to repeat the compromises of its predecessors. Burkina Faso stands as both a case study and a catalyst. The soil has been turned, the seeds are in the ground. But the harvest of sovereignty is never guaranteed. What happens when the guardians of the old order realize that one small nation has written a blueprint others may follow? The expulsion of French troops was not a quiet administrative reshuffle. It was a rupture, a tearing of fabric woven over decades. For Paris, Ouagadougou's decision was framed as instability, a threat to regional order. For Washington and London, it was interpreted through the lens of geopolitics. Was Burkina Faso sliding into Moscow's orbit? Was Beijing whispering in the background? Yet for ordinary Burkinabe, the day French soldiers left their soil felt like dawn breaking after a long night. Crowds filled the capital, waving flags, chanting songs of dignity, holding portraits of Ibrahim Traoré high in the air. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of defiance and relief. For many, it was the first time they felt the government acted not as a proxy for foreign interests, but as the custodian of national pride. In interviews, young men and women spoke of regaining the right to breathe our own air. This moment of popular mobilization echoed the past. When Thomas Sankara refused the debt trap of international lenders, he became a target. When Patrice Lumumba resisted Belgium's control over Congolese minerals, he was eliminated. When Muammar Gaddafi proposed a continental currency backed by gold, his nation was bombed into chaos. Each high point of African sovereignty was met with violent reaction. The pattern became chillingly clear. Leaders who served their people too faithfully rarely died peacefully. And so the question arose, would Traoré survive the storm he had summoned? Western headlines called him a radical. Commentators warned of Russian manipulation, branding him a puppet of the Kremlin rather than an independent African voice. The framing was deliberate. By painting African agency as foreign influence, global media sought to strip it of legitimacy. But the response within Africa told another story. In Mali and Niger, citizens rallied in support of Burkina Faso. Regional youth movements declared solidarity, holding signs that read, "Our resources, our future." On social media, African users from Lagos to Johannesburg debated not whether Traoré was right, but how far others should follow his lead. This was not rejection of the West out of hatred. It was affirmation of Africa out of love. International institutions reacted with unease. ECOWAS officials warned of destabilization. European diplomats whispered of sanctions. Meanwhile, Russian and Chinese envoys offered cooperation framed as partnership. Moscow proposed military training. Beijing offered infrastructure projects. The symbolism was clear. Alternatives existed, and Burkina Faso was willing to explore them. The intensity of the reactions revealed the stakes. Western powers feared contagion. The idea that one small, landlocked nation could inspire a domino effect of renegotiated contracts, expelled foreign troops, and newly confident governments across the continent. For decades, external control had relied not on brute force alone, but on the belief that alternatives were impossible. Burkina Faso shattered that belief. Inside the country, the atmosphere oscillated between celebration and apprehension. Families worried about economic retaliation, about aid being cut, about investment drying up. Yet even these fears were framed as sacrifices worth making if sovereignty could be achieved. One farmer reportedly told a journalist, "Better to eat little in dignity than to eat much in chains." This high point of defiance crystallized the clash between perception and reality. For the West, it was a crisis. For Africans seeking dignity, it was a rebirth. Between these two interpretations lay the battleground of global narratives, fought in headlines, hashtags, and television screens. The crescendo of this confrontation raised a sobering truth. Every act of emancipation carries a cost, and every declaration of independence tests the patience of powers unwilling to let go. Would this surge of pride harden into lasting independence, or would history repeat itself in coups, sanctions, and shadows? The morning after celebration often carries the weight of reality. For Burkina Faso, the euphoria of reclaimed sovereignty soon collided with the practicalities of governance. Food prices, already volatile, rose as supply chains adjusted. Aid packages that once subsidized essential goods were withheld or delayed. families in Ouagadougou began to feel the immediate pinch, asking whether dignity could fill empty bowls. Yet hardship was not the whole story. In rural areas, government initiatives to boost local production found fertile ground. Programs encouraged farmers to cultivate staples for domestic markets instead of export crops. Community seed banks emerged, and extension workers trained villagers in methods designed to reduce dependence on imported fertilizers. It was not a revolution overnight, but it was the slow construction of self-reliance brick by brick. In the political arena, Traoré's stance reshaped the nation's discourse. Opposition voices accused him of recklessness, warning that alienating international donors risked plunging Burkina Faso into isolation. But supporters countered with a deeper argument. What is the price of perpetual dependence? Citizens debated not just policies, but principles. For the first time in decades, public conversation shifted from who would deliver aid to how the country could generate its own wealth. Security remained a pressing challenge. Insurgent groups exploited moments of transition, attacking villages and testing state capacity. Traoré's government responded by redirecting resources toward national defense and calling on citizens to contribute through volunteer corps. Though controversial, this mobilization embodied a philosophy. Sovereignty is not a contract signed in distant capitals, but a daily commitment borne by the people themselves. The international backlash was palpable. Some Western governments reduced cooperation, citing governance concerns. Yet these very measures bolstered the argument inside Burkina Faso that foreign involvement had always been conditional, never neutral. Citizens began to see economic pain not as failure, but as evidence of the high stakes involved in reclaiming control. Generational divides surfaced. Older citizens, remembering the stability of foreign aid, worried about the risks. Younger Burkinabe, connected through smartphones and social media, celebrated the break. They shared clips of Traoré's speeches, comparing them to Sankara's vision, and called this period the unfinished revolution. They believed that short-term sacrifice could yield long-term freedom. The concept of Ibrahim Traoré legacy began to circulate. Commentators argued that even if his leadership were cut short, the precedent he set would endure. To expel foreign troops, renegotiate contracts, and place dignity above convenience was to inscribe a path for successors. Like seeds planted in arid soil, the fruits might ripen in the next generation rather than the present. Domestically, the sense of ownership grew. State television ran programs on Made in Burkina Faso initiatives. Musicians composed songs about sovereignty, blending traditional rhythms with modern beats. Schools introduced lessons about resource management and civic responsibility. It was as if the entire society had been invited to participate in rewriting the national script. Still, questions loomed large. Could the fragile economy survive without foreign capital? Could security forces repel insurgents without external support? Could citizens tolerate the hardship long enough for reforms to bear fruit? These uncertainties hung heavy over every market stall and village meeting. Burkina Faso had chosen a road less traveled. The destination promised dignity, but the terrain was rocky and steep. And as history had shown, those who walked this road often faced ambushes from within and without. Would the sacrifices of today cement a foundation for sovereignty tomorrow? Or would the weight of hardship drag the nation back into dependency's familiar embrace? Beyond Ouagadougou's streets, the ripples of Burkina Faso's defiance reached conference halls and diplomatic cables. The African Union issued carefully worded statements, recognizing the nation's right to sovereignty while urging stability. ECOWAS, historically aligned with Western interests, voiced concerns about coups and governance, but its warnings rang hollow to populations who viewed the bloc as a guardian of foreign influence rather than African dignity. In Europe, diplomats in Paris and Brussels framed Traoré's moves as destabilizing. Policy papers spoke of risks to regional security, a familiar euphemism for disrupted economic arrangements. Behind the language of concern lay unease. If one small nation could demand fairer mining contracts, what prevented larger states from following? Across the Atlantic, Washington debated strategy. Some argued for sanctions, others for increased engagement to counter Russian and Chinese influence. For the United States, the issue was less about Burkina Faso itself and more about precedent. If African countries proved capable of asserting independence successfully, the architecture of Western leverage, loans, aid, military bases, would begin to crumble. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing seized the opportunity. Russian representatives promised training and equipment, branding it as partnership without political strings. Chinese officials highlighted infrastructure investments, roads, railways, energy, delivered faster than Western promises. These offers were not without self-interest, but their framing contrasted sharply with Western lectures. To Burkinabe eyes, tractors and transmission lines spoke louder than sanctions and speeches. The international media war intensified. Western outlets depicted Traore as reckless, even dangerous. African media, increasingly bold, countered with narratives of dignity and resistance. On social platforms, young Africans rejected the idea that demanding sovereignty equated to extremism. They argued that the true extremism was centuries of exploitation packaged as partnership. The discourse revealed a deeper truth. Burkina Faso was no longer just a country, it was a question posed to the world. Could Africa carve a path independent of traditional powers? Could new alliances, however imperfect, provide room for genuine development? It was in this debate that a long-term perspective emerged, Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. Analysts speculated whether his policies, if sustained and adopted continent-wide, might shape Africa's economic architecture by mid-century. The vision was not merely about Burkina Faso surviving the present. It was about Africa thriving in the future, with its own industries, financial systems, and political agency. For Western capitals, the fear was not the fall of Burkina Faso, but its success. For African youth, the hope was not only survival, but transformation. Between these poles lay the contest that would define the next generation. Could the continent align behind a shared vision before external powers recalibrated to reassert control? Every revolution reaches a crossroads. For Burkina Faso, the path forward is both perilous and promising. The nation stands at the threshold of a new era, carrying the hopes of a continent that has too often been told what it cannot do. The question is not only whether Burkina Faso can endure the weight of sovereignty, but whether Africa itself will walk the same road. The risks are undeniable. Economic retaliation from powerful states could squeeze fragile markets. Security threats from insurgent groups may intensify, exploiting instability to weaken confidence. Political isolation could leave Burkina Faso cut off from investment and international platforms. History has shown that the guardians of the old order rarely surrender privileges quietly. Yet the opportunities gleam like ore beneath the soil. Regional integration through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement offers access to a market of over 1 billion people. The processing of gold and other resources within Africa could transform the continent from an exporter of raw wealth to a producer of finished value. Technological innovation, from mobile banking to renewable energy, presents the chance to leapfrog development stages once deemed unavoidable. Most importantly, the future lies in human capital. Africa's youth, connected across borders by digital networks, no longer accept the inevitability of dependency. They demand leaders who serve African interests, rather than foreign approval. If this energy is channeled into education, entrepreneurship, and governance, it could become the engine of the most profound transformation in modern history. The road is neither short nor straight. It requires sacrifice, patience, and resilience, but it also promises dignity, pride, and genuine independence. Burkina Faso has placed its footsteps firmly on this path. Whether others follow will determine whether the harvest is plentiful or sparse. This struggle is not only national, it is continental. It is not only African, it is global. For if one small nation can defy the weight of empires, what stops an entire continent from reshaping the world? The soil has been turned, the seeds are sown. But who will guard the harvest when storms inevitably come? Africa has always been described by others as a frontier to be conquered, a market to be tapped, a warehouse of resources waiting to be emptied. Yet today, in the heart of Burkina Faso, that narrative is being rewritten. Ibrahim Traoré's defiance is more than a political decision. It is a reminder that sovereignty begins with the courage to say no, and with the vision to build something greater in its place. The legacy of this moment cannot be measured only in contracts renegotiated or troops expelled. It lies in the awakening of a people who believe once again that the soil beneath their feet can nourish their future rather than enrich others. This is the heartbeat of an unfinished revolution, the insistence that Africa deserves not pity, not aid, but partnership on its own terms. The story of Burkina Faso is becoming a chapter in a broader book, one written by millions of Africans determined to complete what earlier generations began. The question is not whether the road will be easy, it is whether the road will be walked. History teaches us that empires resist change, that power concedes nothing without struggle. But history also teaches us that when a people unite, when they refuse to bow, when they plant seeds of dignity in soil long neglected, the harvest is inevitable. This is the beginning of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy, a story not of one man, but of a continent rising to claim its voice. It is a vision stretching beyond the present, toward a horizon some already call the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050. By then, Africa could stand not as the world's quarry, but as its equal, a producer, a partner, a beacon. Stay with us. Comment, share, and subscribe if you believe Africa's story deserves to be told in its own words. Your voice strengthens this movement. Your presence ensures it cannot be silenced, because the future of Africa will not be dictated. It will be chosen, and the choice begins now.